We're well before any sign of a Palestinian country or state or the name even. We talked a little bit earlier that it wasn't even used. It was at Syria, Palestina, 135 AD, and that was Emperor Hadrian. That we see that name even come about. We're well many thousands of years before that moment, when this is established as an everlasting covenant about this land that is still a hot point of controversy today.
Yeah, as to who is entitled to the land. And that's why we go back to not just our opinions, but what does the Word of God say? People can be upset and say, oh, well, no, it's a Palestinian land and the Jews stole it. Well, the reality is that couldn't be further from the truth. And if you don't like that, you can argue with God. But God makes it clear, and we just enunciated through the pages of Scripture what God's plan is. And so what I think is so crucial for people to understand is you can't just spiritualize all of these things away in terms of the times in which we're living right now. And there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, all of these promises that God made, that's actually for the church. And, Israel is no longer Israel, it's the church that gets those promises, but somehow Israel gets to keep all the negative parts of it, the curses.
Welcome to this episode of Zion's Wire, the official podcast of Zion's Hope, where we bring you biblical insight and prophetic discussions with a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. I'm Christopher Diaz, and today we're going to jump into the Abrahamic Covenant and the Promised Land of Israel. I have Dave Rosenthal with me.
Great to be here.
Bob Hunt.
Thank you.
All right. Last week we touched on the seed, and that kind of just started everything. So I'm going to toss this to you, Dave, and give a quick recap here of where we went and where we're going.
Sure. Well, Genesis 3, specifically verse 15, is so pivotal to understanding God's intent for the ultimate redemption of humanity. It's the verse about the seed of the woman, the seed that would come to bruise the serpent's head, and that there would be another seed, which would also come, the seed of Satan, that would bruise the Messiah's heel, or bruise the other seed's heel. And this is such a pivotal verse because it deals with the issue that was at hand in the book of Genesis, which is the fall of humanity, and how God will stay true to His nature and His character. That's the issue. How does a holy, righteous God, who is perfect in every attribute, who is holy, just, righteous, how does He find a way to redeem a lost and fallen creation and humanity without cheating in order to do it? And there is a method, a means by which God will bring the ultimate redemption of humanity, and that is through the promised seed, an ultimate reference, we believe, to Jesus Christ. And so the question that we asked is, well, okay, if there's a promised seed, then where is that seed going to come from? And I would go back to the beginning even further, and it's not just an issue of sin entering into the world as an operating principle. Yes, that is a crucial component in that, and sin has to be dealt with and judged appropriately and righteously by God. But mankind lost something. It's not just that sin entered the world. Mankind lost through Adam and Eve and their sin in the garden. They lost what God had originally intended for them and for all of humanity, was to be king of the earth, to have rulership, to have dominion over the earth. And so all of humanity, through Adam and Eve, lost what God had originally intended, which was for mankind to have dominion over the earth. And so the issue is, if a man lost that dominion, lost that what God had promised, their destiny, if mankind lost that, then a man must restore it. A man must find a way to restore it. And Obviously, in our sin condition, that is an impossibility unless there is divine intervention. And therefore, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we have the promise of a seed, a man that would come. And I would say ultimately, that seed is a reference again to Jesus Christ in his divinity. In other words, he is 100% God, but he will also be a man. And that's why the virgin birth, because Jesus Christ was the God-man, 100% God and 100% man, because only a man could recapture the lost destiny that Adam and Eve lost in the garden, to be ruler or to have dominion over the earth. So now when we get to Genesis 3, there's a promise of a seed. And the question is, where's that seed coming from? And I think we want to jump into a little bit more about that promised seed and an individual that God would call to be the father of that lineage.
That's right. One more point, if I could, on it has to be a man. And that's very, very important. I think one other important factor is it has to be a man. Well, it also has to be God.
Right.
Because sin ultimately is against God. Who is God? God's an eternal being. So when we sin against an eternal being, we need a like-kind solution to that problem. And so Christ represents mankind, it represents Adam and Eve, but ultimately all mankind. But he also is that divine being, the only one that could qualify to bear that punishment.
Right.
And so those two natures, as they come together in one person, fulfill the ultimate solution, the only solution.
That's why we get to the book of Revelation. Who is worthy to step forward to loose the seals and to bring history to a proper consummation?
Yeah.
And there's a search that's made, and at first there's no one found who's worthy. And then John is told, no, you missed someone. Take another look. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So the issue is who is worthy, and it must be the God-man, and only Jesus fits that criteria.
Yeah. And now you mentioned who is going to take us the next step. Adam, he represents mankind even in his name. He is mankind. It's interesting because God now is going to start to hone down how he's going to execute his plan. He's going to move from just general mankind. He's actually going to start maybe the initial steps in forming a nation. And so we go to chapter 12 of Genesis. Chapter 3 to chapter 12 seems like only 9 chapters. It's a little over 2,000 years in most books. It's 2,000 years later. Wait a minute, the promise of seed was back here, year 1 on a Jewish calendar, but Abraham doesn't pop into the Jewish calendar about year 2018 is the best guess. So that's a long time to have to wait. Can you imagine all of the mothers and fathers? Is this the one? Is this the one? Even Eve, back in Genesis, when Cain came about, she says, I have a man. You get a sense that maybe she was thinking, this is the seed. No, Eve, wait. 2,000 years later. But let me read the text of the promise as we start to expand that promise a little bit, and you'll hear it. In verse 1 of chapter 12, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It's a powerful passage.
It is.
They're calling out and see how we went from blessing all the families of the earth, the seeds, to what? Land. Wasn't mentioned in 3:15, nothing about a land, but doesn't a nation or a people have to have land?
Yeah.
And so here we see the first inklings, hey, you need a land, as he calls Abram.
A threefold promise is what I heard you reading.
Yeah.
A nation, a blessing in the name, and then land.
Yeah.
For 3 parts.
And when I think of blessing, we typically use the word bless or blessing in connection to somebody sneezing sometimes, bless you or God bless you. But it's kind of almost a throwaway term or a throwaway word. But there's so much bound up in the concept of blessing. When God says, I'm blessing you, he's saying, I'm giving you life, and I myself, God says, I'm giving you goodness upon that life. If you go back a few chapters to Noah and his family, they descend off of the ark, and God blesses them, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So blessing is associated with life and the goodness of God upon that life, and that's why you have be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So now when you talk about Abram, and God says to him, I'm going to bless you, it's life and the goodness of God upon that life. If you have blessing from God, you have everything you could ever want. So to Abram, God says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to bless you, life and goodness, and I'm going to make your name great, and you're going to be a blessing, life and goodness, to the nations as well. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. So that blessing continues on beyond just Abraham. God says, I'm going to bless you. If you bless Abram as the father of a great multitude and his posterity, there's going to be great blessing that comes to you as well.
Has that blessing gone away?
That's still around.
It's still today, this very day. Blessing and cursing still exists. On who?
Yeah.
The nation Israel.
Yeah.
On the same people he called out through Abraham.
So if we jump down to verse 7 in Genesis 12, and the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. So God calls Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern day Iraq, and he travels the Fertile Crescent because the most direct route would have been through the wilderness or the desert. But they take the Fertile Crescent. Abraham comes around and comes down from the north to the south into the land of Canaan at that time. And God says, unto thy seed I will give this land. I mean, it couldn't be more clear.
And very good. I agree with all of that. But you know what's interesting is the next sentence. If you look at the very next sentence, not verse, and there he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. What I see there, many commentators see, is the Lord's blessing of what's going on here. Abraham moves, and I believe this is Shechem. He moves into Shechem. Very first place mentioned here. An altar is built. God blesses him through this appearance of his. And we could continue through 12 and further, but let me just make one point here is he'll go to Bethel and Ai next, between the two. Guess what he does? He builds another altar to God. Again, further blessing. And then where does he go lastly? He goes to Hebron. What does he do? He's marking out the territory in altars. Now here's the interesting part, for me anyway. When Jacob comes along, do you know that he goes to those exact 3 places and does the similar type of situation as Abraham, thus reconfirming the steps and the divine blessing and occupation of the land?
That's powerful.
Confirming, you just mentioned that, and makes me think, okay, jumping into the confirming of this covenant, I think that takes us into chapter 15.
Before we get to 15, let's go to 13. Because you're right, but I love this story because I think it's so powerful. And
you've been there on top of these mountains.
Yes.
You've been there.
Yes. There was a famine in the land where God brought Abram in the land of Canaan. He goes down to Egypt, and there's a whole story of things that took place there. But when Abram comes out of Egypt, here's the blessing. He's a wealthy man when he comes out of Egypt. And his nephew Lot also is wealthy, and there's some skirmishes between the herdsmen of both, Lot and Abram. And Abram says, hey, let's divide this amicably. And Lot, you can choose where you want to go with your herds and your family, and I'll take the other. And Lot chose, of course, the fertile plain where you have the Jordan River flowing down towards what is today the Dead Sea, and it was lush and green. Of course, Sodom and Gomorrah were there, and we know the story of how that goes. But in verse 14 of Genesis 13, the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art. Now, let's stop for a second. Where was Abram? Well, at the beginning of this chapter, we see that he's in Bethel. And Bethel, incidentally, and not to be missed, is just north of Jerusalem. And it is in the mountains of the area in Israel today. It's in the mountainous region, and it's one of the highest places in Israel. So from the place that God has Abram at that time, it's Bethel. And he's looking, and what does God say in verse 14? He says, look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward, all 4 directions. And he says, I will make thy seed as the dust, or back up, it says, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever.
Forever.
So here's Abram on one of the highest mountains in Israel, Bethel, north of Jerusalem, and he's looking in all 4 directions. And from there, on a clear day, you can almost see to the Sea of Galilee. And you can see over towards the coast, the Mediterranean coast to the west. And you can see to the east across the Jordan Valley into what is today modern Jordan. And to the south, likely all the way almost to the Dead Sea and beyond. So from this very high location, God says, I want you to look all directions, and all the land which you see, I will give it to thy seed forever. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. And in verse 16, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. And God says, arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. So what an amazing story. And again, geography plays and topography plays such an important part of these stories. So it's so important that people understand the topography and the geography of these places to get the full impact of what's really taking place here. Now let's go to the next. Let's go to the next chapter.
And 15.
15.
So this is amazing language that we see in chapter 15 of what happens and what transpires between God and Abraham. Abraham's asking the question here of the land. He's been shown the land. He's looked at the land, and he's posing this question of, well, how will it be?
How am I going to know?
How am I going to know?
Yeah.
He doesn't have any heirs at this point. He doesn't have any children at this point. Little time has passed. It doesn't say how much time. People guess, but it says after these things, the word of the Lord comes. So you can get a sense that Abraham internally is probably struggling now, or Abram at this point, but he's probably struggling. He's like, okay, God promised, I saw it. There's the land I'm going to fill it with, because he says I'm going to fill it with descendants there in chapter 13, but nothing's happened.
Yeah, you get to verse 6, and it says, and he believed in the Lord. Abraham exhibited faith, and he counted it to him for righteousness.
I would just love to take that alone and spend a whole time on
a lot
that.
there.
There's so much in that one verse.
Yes.
But we won't. We're talking about the land.
We'll save that for another day.
Another episode.
Yeah.
And he said to him, verse 7, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give this land to inherit it. So it's very clear once again. And in verse 8, and he said, Abram to the Lord, he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? I love that. He's having a conversation, very candid, and he's a man of faith. We just see that, in the previous verses. He's following the Lord's command to travel to new land and to do these different things. And Abraham is a man of faith. But even then, he says, Lord God, I know you're saying you're giving me this land to my posterity. And he says, but how am I going to know that I'm going to inherit it? And I love the rest of the answer in terms of what God does. And he answers them. Yeah, he does. He gives them an exact answer.
Doesn't it remind you of John the Baptist?
Yeah.
Are you the coming one?
Yeah.
Are you the one we're expecting?
And we question, how could John the Baptist ask that kind of a question?
But here we also learn that God, from an honest heart, he respects honest questions.
Right.
A question like the Pharisees always had, he's not going to answer those, but from an honest heart, one of integrity, one seeking after God, he doesn't mind questions. Ask him. Fire away. He'll give you an answer.
That's a great point.
It may be 10, 15 years later, but you'll get an answer.
So
always had 3 answers: no, yes, and not yet.
Not yet.
So.
Okay, so take us further into the story, starting with verse 9, in terms of God's answer to Abram and what he has him do.
Yeah, this is an interesting situation. I mean, it really brings us back to the old Hebrew scriptures where they're making a covenant. A covenant is, I think it's a Brit, called a Brit in Hebrew, but it's an agreement. Okay, but this agreement is going to be different, and you can see that by how God institutes this agreement between him and Abraham. How am I going to know? Because here's the agreement I'm making with you.
So it was just a piece of paper that Abram signed?
Yeah, no. Abram was told to go take a nap, as your father might say. This is God saying, we're going to make a covenant, an agreement, unilateral, unconditional, meaning unbreakable, everlasting. These are so important points because as we discuss the contents of what they're talking about, we're talking about land, we're talking about a nation. These are all God alone instituted them and did it. Let's read through it. Starting verse 9, he says, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and young pigeon." Then he brought all these to him, cut them in two. Very important, don't miss that. Down the middle, and placed each piece opposite the other. You have the picture? But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and will afflict them 400 years."
Which is a reference to
the Exodus issue and the
story,
banishment.
the Israelites
Story
being
of
enslaved
Pharaoh.
for 400 years down in Egypt under Pharaoh.
Yeah. And I don't know how much you want me to continue on in all of this.
Well, it's the point is in the next few verses is that he's really recounting or really prophesying, giving a prophecy of what will transpire to Abraham's descendants, that they will be a stranger in a strange land. They will be enslaved for 400 years. But in the 4th generation, verse 16, they shall come hither again, and they'll come out of that enslavement and bondage. But verse 17, to pick up on the story, pick up there.
All right, 17, "And it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold," picture it, "there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, Pezerites, Rephaim, the Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and the Jebusites."
And there's a lot of ites in there.
There are a lot of ites in there, but a lot of land in there.
There is, and let's correct, because these are tribal areas or groups, and they're occupying parts of the land. So very important. Let's go back though and really unpack this answer that God is giving to Abraham. Abraham says, "Lord, I see you're promising me a land, but how do I know that I'm going to inherit it and my descendants?" And God does something amazing. He cuts a covenant. And when I say cuts a covenant, that's an important word. I teased earlier, is it a piece of paper, where they sign a covenant? That's the way we make agreements or accords. It's a signature or a handshake. But in ancient times, covenants or these kind of important, crucial promises were cut, and they were not just cut, they were cut in blood.
Right.
And so the fact that God tells Abram, he says, "I want you to take these animals and I want you to sever them. I want you killing them." And it's the reality is it was a very bloody mess. And these animals were cut and they were severed and put opposite one another. And what's amazing in this account is that God puts Abram into a deep sleep.
Right.
And so Abram, through the rest of this story, is in a deep sleep. And what we see at the end in verse 17, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between those severed animal parts. And what this is a representative of God himself who is walking through those animal parts. Did Abram walk through those animal parts? No, he was in a deep sleep.
Yeah, but normally both parties making the covenant would both walk through.
Exactly. And the idea is, the reason that there's this cutting, this blood cutting, is because the idea is, may what happened to these animals happen to me and to you if we're making a covenant, if we don't abide by the terms of the covenant. So in that case, if it's you and I, Chris, or Bob, you and I, making this covenant, it is cut between the two of us. And the idea is, if we don't keep our end of the bargain, may what happened to this sacrificed animal, this blood cutting, happen to us if we don't abide by the covenant. So it's a very serious thing. And so now, in answer to Abram's question, how am I going to know that I'm going to inherit it? God says, I'm going to cut a covenant. But what's unusual about this covenant that was cut is that it was God himself. Abram was put into a deep sleep. So God himself walks between these severed animal parts. And what this is saying is that this covenant that God is making to give a land in answer to Abram's question, to say, I'm giving you this land as an everlasting inheritance. And God says, I'm going to make the covenant myself. So, which means it is unilateral. It is one party.
And unconditional.
And unconditional. Abram didn't have to do anything. God made the covenant. So it is unilateral and unconditional for the land.
It's also unbreakable.
Absolutely.
Can God die? Obviously, he cannot die.
Right.
That's why a lot of people have had some arguments and discussions on this, because God can't die.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if God can't die, then it's unbreakable.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it leads
eternal.
you to. Eternal.
Yeah.
It's impossible for him to die. And so some people said, oh, God can't die, so this really doesn't have anything to do with death. And I'll just make a side note for anybody that wants to look it up. Turn to Jeremiah 34, 17 through 20. You see the same type of covenant being done, but a direct reference that if you break this, you will die. And so there's a consequence that's expected here and spelled out quite plainly in that passage. So I would say it's unbreakable, it's unconditional, and it's unilateral.
Yeah. Chris, take us through verse 18, and then maybe we can unpack that a little bit, because it's a great verse,
Yeah,
an important one.
Let's go back to it. All right, so we have, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land. And then again, from the river of Egypt, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates.
So let's stop there. Let's stop
before
there.
we get to the ites.
Yes, because this is, again, geography, so important to understand. So in this unilateral, unconditional, unbreakable covenant that God made with Abraham for his seed to inherit this land, now we're finding out where the land is.
Right, we have a border.
We have borders, and we have tangible locations to understand. Now, so let's unpack it for a second. I have given this land from the river of Egypt. And so instantly, people who've looked at this verse...
We've had this conversation, because I initially thought, is this the Nile River?
Yeah.
But do you have another thought?
Well, it's understandable because it's iconic. I mean, Egypt is Egypt because of the Nile River. And 90+% of the population, even today, lives along the Nile River basin, because the rest of it is really desert and wilderness. And the Nile River is that life-giving, sustenance to supply the population. So the Nile River is naturally, I think, where people go in terms of their thinking. But if God is saying, I'm giving you the promised land from the Nile River, which is essentially Egypt itself, is God saying, I'm giving you Egypt as part of your promised land? And I would suggest that that's not the case. And I think there's some nuance here that I think is important, which we'll talk about in a minute. But from the river of Egypt, I would suggest that most likely it is talking about what was known as kind of a border area, even in ancient times, which is a dry wadi, or a dry river basin, that comes from the Mediterranean and goes south a little bit further to the east of the Nile River, quite a bit further from the east to the east of the Nile River. And it's in a town today called El Arish. So if you look at a map, El Arish, I would suggest that may be what's in view here when God is saying, I'm giving you from the river of Egypt. And notice the next phrase. He says, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So the Nile River, which is also known as a great river, right? A very long river. The text doesn't say from the great river of Egypt. It just says from the river of Egypt.
Right.
But when it gets to the Euphrates, it says from the river unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And of course, we know today that the Euphrates River is a river that flows from Turkey into Iraq and it's a very significant, very important river down towards the top of the Persian Gulf. So that is a very wide swath of land.
Yeah, much larger than what Israel is today.
Yeah, what Israel is today is a small sliver of that entire area. And I would suggest, and this is just on a side note, that the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, even recently referenced the idea that Israel, he says, Israel has ambitions to take over some of our former Turkish lands from history during the Ottoman Empire. And I think what he has in mind is the concept of some of the Orthodox Jewish people in Israel who would say, no, what we have today of Israel, this is just a fraction of what God really promised us. And so even Israel's Muslim, Islamic, and Arab neighbors are aware of these promises and prophecies. Yeah.
What's interesting too, let's just flip back to Genesis. Go to the Garden of Eden front. Do you know that one of the rivers there is the Euphrates? Of the four there?
Right.
And that's the one spelled right out. I mean, you got others in there. So are we getting a reflection of perhaps Garden of Eden being restored? And we may very well be seeing that here as God is giving in
an ultimate sense, bringing it back full circle to what he had originally intended.
Yeah, like you said, redeeming the land.
Right.
Yeah.
And so,
right. Then I think it doesn't end there, though. We see the Abrahamic Covenant continue, and I don't want to jump ahead too quickly if you had another thought there.
No, let's
But
keep
we
going.
begin to shift forward and look into 17, and we see something else laid out. 17, 7 and 8. We come into, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout the generations. For, here it is again, an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land of the sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. There again, everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And then what happens next?
Yeah, it's amazing. And even earlier in that chapter, once again, God is reiterating, I'm going to have this covenant between me and thee, and will multiply, once again, the blessing, of God. You're going to be a father of many nations. And so it's amazing that God is continuing to reiterate the covenant that he's made with Abraham and for the land, and that he's going to make him the father of a great multitude. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to multiply you. And so now the challenge is, Abraham says, well, how's that going to become a reality? Because we've got a problem. I'm an old man, right?
Yeah.
And Abraham, when he hears this, he's actually thinking that because he took matters into his own hands with his handmaid, Hagar, and they had a child, Ishmael. And when you get all the way to verse 18 in Genesis 17, Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. So in Abraham's thinking that it must be Ishmael, he's an old man, and his wife, Sarah, is old. How is it going to be even possible for them to bear a child? And verse 19, God makes it very, very clear.
Very clear.
God said, Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed. So it's not Hagar. It's not Ishmael, the offspring of Hagar through Abraham. It is through Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him. Hear that language? Establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. We hear this you focused on it. It's over and over again, an everlasting covenant. If we're going to take God at his word, then we have to understand that when he's repeating everlasting covenant, that's what he means.
And can I just back up just 1 second? Because I think, and I don't know if it's in variations in verses or whatnot, you said how clear and distinctively God answered him. When I'm reading it, it says in the beginning of 19, it says, in reference to asking about Ishmael, but God said no. And then he goes, but through through Sarah, he'll bring forth this child. So again, very, very clear answer. And then again, reiteration of an everlasting covenant.
Do you see the word if in there? If, again, no conditions. And so, again, let's go back right to the covenant itself. It's an everlasting, I mean, I don't understand the struggle today with people as they don't understand this and try and say that, they've lost the covenant, they've lost the land or other things that have to do, or they lost even their right to be God's chosen nation.
Right.
Or the promises are to be inherited by another individual or another group or the church.
Right. Sure.
I mean, that's what we hear so much. But it couldn't be clearer here in 19. God says, I'm going to establish my covenant through Isaac for an everlasting covenant and with his seed after him. Now, verse 20, this is interesting and also important. As for Ishmael, I have heard thee, Abraham. Behold, I have blessed him, life and goodness, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. So obviously, from Ishmael, you have many nations that have sprung up. We see them throughout the Middle East. But verse 21, God reiterates and makes it very clear, lest you have any questions, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. So God makes it perfectly clear that both will be blessed, both will be have many nations spring forth from them, both Isaac and Ishmael, but God makes it clear that the covenant will be established through Isaac. So that's so crucially important because, again, we're going back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And that is the promised seed that would bring ultimate redemption to humanity. Where is the seed coming from? And so don't miss the thread. And that is, the thread is God is calling a man from Ur the Chaldees, Abram, a man of faith who follows what God is instructing him to do. And through Abraham, God has a covenant that he establishes to make Abraham's posterity, make them great and be a great multitude. And God is giving a land for that people to live in as an everlasting inheritance. And then God says, and through your seed, Isaac, that is the one through which the covenant goes, and to his children and to his posterity. And so the seed that would come from Genesis 3 is through that lineage. So while Ishmael and his descendants will also be blessed and have many people groups that spring from Ishmael, the seed, all the way back from Genesis 3:15, through the covenant promises God made with Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and then beyond Jacob, through the tribe of Judah, not the other 11 tribes of Israel, through the tribe of Judah. The Bible says the scepter or kingship will not depart from Judah. So what we're seeing is God saying this is where the seed will be coming from. And it's through this individual who receives a covenant promise, unilateral, unconditional, unbreakable, and for a land that is an everlasting inheritance to Abram and his descendants. And it will be through Isaac. And then we continue on, and we'll know, and we'll save this for another time, through Jacob and through the tribe of Judah, and an ultimate reference to Jesus Christ, who is that promised seed from Genesis chapter 3. So I want to just land here. Yes.
One point while we're here in chapter 17. We've talked about seeds, we've talked about descendants, and so the Jewish people, obviously, through Isaac, are the ones that this promise has been given to. I've heard a lot of people argue and say, well, that doesn't mean the nation Israel, right? Just the Jewish people in general, so it doesn't have to be the nation. But if you look at the verse, and we're reading it right here, it says in verse 20, he says, behold, I have blessed him, and I'll make him fruitful, will multiply him exceeding. He shall beget 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation. That's talking of Ishmael being a nation. But the point is that with Isaac, he will beget a nation. Not just descendants, but a nation, which is where we are today with the nation of Israel.
Right.
And so God has a plan for him.
You've touched on the timeline a couple of times, Bob, and this is jumping to more current day, the controversies we see, Palestine and all these things. This, as you've mentioned and we've highlighted, one everlasting covenant, and the timeline here is we're well before any sign of a Palestinian country or state or the name even. We talked a little bit earlier that it wasn't even used. It was at Syria, Palestinia, 135 AD, and that was Emperor
Hadrian.
That we see that name even come about. We're well many thousands of years before that moment when this is established as an everlasting covenant about this land that is still a hot point of controversy today.
Yeah, as to who is entitled, to the land. And that's why we go back to not just our opinions, but what does the Word of God say? People can be upset and say, oh, well, no, it's a Palestinian land and the Jews stole it. Well, the reality is that couldn't be further from the truth. And if you don't like that, you can argue with God. But God makes it clear, and we just enunciated through the pages of Scripture what God's plan is. And so what I think is so crucial for people to understand is you can't just spiritualize all of these things away in terms of the times in which we're living right now. And there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, all of these promises that God made, that's actually for the church. And, Israel is no longer Israel, it's the church that gets those promises, but somehow Israel gets to keep all the negative parts of it, the curses. But I go to this, I want to go to this one thing that I think is so crucial for people to understand. And that is that all of this is physical through humanity on the earth. That it was man who lost the inheritance that God gave us. It was Adam who lost that. And in Adam, we all lost that, what God had originally intended. And so I said at the beginning that it's only a man who could recapture that, but it had to be a man who was worthy. And there are no worthy men because of sin as an operating principle in the world. It's the virus of sin that taints all of us. So God, in his sovereignty and in his beautiful plan, wraps himself through his son, Jesus Christ, and sends him to humanity to be the one who is worthy to recapture mankind's lost destiny as king of the earth. So all of that was physical. When Jesus came the first time as that promised seed to Bethlehem, he came to earth, to a real place, to a real town, to a real people as a human. Now, he was the God-man, but he was a human, and he was a baby. And he lived a life and he died. And wonderfully, he rose again on the third day and to defeat death. But the point is, he came physically the first time. Right. So when this king, this seed from Genesis 3, is coming back to recapture what humanity lost through Adam and Eve in the garden, he's coming back as a human. He's coming back as the God-man once again. Why is it that we look at his first coming, of Christ's first coming, and we say, well, that's physical, but his second coming is only spiritual and there's no physicality to it? It's just as physical because it's the fulfillment of the end of this magnificent story that God is showing us in terms of his ultimate plan of redemption for humanity and to restore what humanity lost in the garden, which was to rule the earth. So when Jesus Christ returns, he has to come back to a real people, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, to a real land that was promised by God as an everlasting inheritance to Abraham and his descendants. And he's coming back to a real city where he'll be a real king over the earth. And that is to recapture mankind's lost destiny. And that's why in Revelation, the question is, who is worthy to bring history to a proper consummation and to ensure the ultimate redemption of humanity, a remnant of humanity that believes, like faith, like Abraham has faith. So that's the thread that runs through all of this. So to say that Israel is no longer really Israel, that the land isn't really theirs, God didn't really make an everlasting covenant for them to have the land and for Abraham's descendants to have it, is to ignore and to miss the whole point of Jesus Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of that seed of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15.
You just made me think about the disciples talking to Jesus after his death and resurrection and before his ascension. We go to Acts chapter 1, verse 6. And Bob, you brought up our ability to ask God questions, genuine, humble questions. And you see the disciples standing there with him, and they ask him, is this it? Is this the time? Is this when you're restoring the kingdom, which is what you were just referring to? He's going to restore the kingdom. And in their mind, okay, he's died, he's resurrected. Is this it? Is this the moment? Are we going to have the Jewish king reestablish the kingdom? And his answer, he answers them, just like he answered Abraham. He says, not yet. He tells them that it's in the Father's timing that the restoration will come.
Yeah.
Which is huge. In the Father's timing, which tells us, one, it hasn't been completed yet. And it's still to come, that indeed that kingdom will be restored.
The Messianic king
kingdom
will come back,
yes.
and he will rule from Jerusalem over the entire world. And what an amazing kingdom it will be.
Yeah.
And that'll be a physical, literal Jerusalem and a literal place, like you said, over literal people.
Yep.
I mean, we start to, a lot of groups kind of, like you said, symbolically expand what some of these passages mean. And I've heard 70 AD, Christ has already come back and, has executed his plan there. And it's like, you really have to stretch what the words say.
Yeah.
Land is land. A nation is a nation. As a king is a king. Take the Bible for what it says at its face. It's easy. I've always said, you take the Bible at its face unless it's intentionally made to be symbolic. You can see a symbol. It tells us quite often if it's a symbol. We need to learn how to just read the Bible for what it says and then not move away from the literalness unless we have to.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Well, great. I enjoyed it, guys.
Yeah, I think this is one we could continue on, but that's probably a good place to land.
Yeah, we could be here all afternoon.
But for our audience, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep the conversation going. Leave us questions or comments in the comment section, and watch for the next episode. And check out our app where you can keep up to date on everything we have going. Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Zion's Wire, a podcast fueled by a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. If you were encouraged by today's episode, share it with a friend and subscribe so you never miss a moment. Keep the conversation going with questions or comments, and until next time, keep watching, keep praying, and keep your heart fixed on God's Word.